After I made a wish to the dragon Shenron, I realized what I did could make a big difference in a lot of good people's lives, but it might also end badly for some people too. However, the good does outweigh the bad, so when I made the wish to make arranged heterosexual marriages mandatory and legal in the United States, I gave parents a way to get their kids married as soon as possible. When their children are of legal age, even without their consent, they can make them marry whoever they want. And I know that might sound wrong, but it's not really, especially if that person might die alone or even have mental problems because of all that loneliness, and they might even become hopeless from being lonely, and that's just sad. So yes, I did the one thing right that needed to be done in the United States that would have solved a lot of problems, and there would be no weak men or women in America, no feminist behavior, and no nonsense. It would have solved a lot of problems. So now it's mandatory and legal in this world. And so later that day, Carmen Falcone went home and spoke to his daughter Selena Kyle, and him and his family set up a date for her to meet with me. And when I finally met her, I was surprised to find a young Halle Berry look-alike Selena Kyle staring back at me, and I read her thoughts, and she said, "My God, he's handsome and muscular," and she blushed and I smiled big, and Carmen Falcone smirked big and said in his mind, "I know she likes him, this could work out for the best." And I heard Carmine's thoughts. I knew what he wanted: to permanently tie me to his bloodline so he could get infinite resources from me, and he's right. If I married his daughter, he would definitely have access to all my resources. And I met her in a nice restaurant, and I said, "Carmen, you didn't tell me she was so beautiful, even gorgeous." And Selena Kyle blushed and she seemed shy, and Carmen Falcone said she's shy, she hasn't been on many dates yet. And I said we were all like that once, and I said maybe I can take her someplace fun after this, I think she might like that. And then she looked me in the eyes and she said, "You're very handsome, Bruce Wayne." And I said, "Thank you for the compliment, ma'am." And I said, "Carmen, if you don't mind, I would like to take your daughter on a fun date. I will see you later." And he said, "Very well, I will leave after I eat dinner or whatever." And I said, "Good." And then I said, "If you want to, Selena, please follow me." And she said, "Okay." And then I walked and I talked to her, and then I took her someplace where we could talk privately, and I said, "I have superpowers and I can teleport anywhere. Do you want to go somewhere fun?" And she said, "I always wanted to go to the Atlantis Resort in the Bahamas." And then I walked up to her and I hugged her waist and I said, "Hold on tightly." And I said, "Kai Kai." And then like magic we appeared in the Bahamas, and she said, "Oh my God, that was incredible powers. What are you?" And I said, "Well, I could tell you, but I'm sure you want to start having fun." And I pointed at the giant pyramid slide, and she said, "I always wanted to slide down that pyramid slide." And I said, "We will do it together." And then we checked in at the hotel and we got a very nice room on short notice, and then I paid for everything, of course, and it's easy for me because I literally have a black credit card without a limit. And then she would proceed to slide down that large pyramid slide many times, and I slid down with her in my lap, and she finally saw me without my shirt on and she stared at me because I literally have the body of a gym god or a Greek god. And since Selena Kyle looks like a young beautiful Halle Berry, I loved staring at her in her bikini and thong as well. And since we are both sexually attracted to each other, we naturally had sex many times. And then something happened. When I had sex with her, I felt the love in my heart for her, and I knew I wanted her to have my kids, so I definitely impregnated her. And she said that was wonderful, and then I said yes it was, and then I started giving her oral pleasure, and she said, "Oh my God, baby, yes." And then right after all that, I married Selena Kyle, and now I am almost done marrying women. And I forgot about Feora. I pretty much left her in an unbreakable prison cell after I broke her mind. After I had sex with her, she had massive orgasms and her brain went into shock, but I left her my clone, so I'm sure he helped her out, and I know she already had sex with him many times because I can see all that, and he even told her he's coming back to marry you soon. And Feora smiled with her child in her arms and she said, "Good, it's about time he remembered." And then I took Selena Kyle home to our Ellsworth building I bought in the Diamond District, and I set her up in a nice apartment with cat statues and a lot of cat things in her nice apartment. And she said, "Oh my God, I love this place." And she said, "You did all this for me?" And I said, "Of course, darling, I must go now." And then I left her with my clone and she smiled.